Middle of my sister's wedding reception, my father stood up from the head table, tapped his champagne flute with a butter knife, and announced to 200 guests that I had wasted my entire life chasing a fantasy. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. Medicine, he declared, his voice carrying over the music, over the clinking of glasses, over the soft conversation of people who were about to witness something they'd never forget. 3 years of medical school, 3 years of our money, and she walked away. He shook his head slowly, the way he always did when he wanted the disappointment to land. Some people aren't built for the real world. My name is Audra Calloway. I'm 32 years old. I'm a licensed psychiatric nurse practitioner and the lead mental health consultant for a federal prison system serving over 4,000 incarcerated people across 2 states. I speak in federal courtrooms. I've been cited in case law. I have letters from 3 U.S. senators thanking me for my testimony. My father had just told 200 people that I was a failure. And my brother, standing beside him with his champagne flute already raised, was smiling. I sat at table 11 in a bridesmaid dress the color of sage, my hands folded in my lap, and I breathed. Just breathed. Because the girl who used to cry in parking lots over things like this was gone. And what came next was something my father never saw coming. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand what happened that night at the Whitmore Grand in Louisville, you have to understand the 20 years that came before it. My father is a surgeon, not a good man who happens to be a surgeon. A surgeon first, and everything else, husband, father, human being, somewhere further down the list. He built his identity around precision and performance, and he expected his children to be extensions of that identity. My brother fit the mold from the beginning. Pre-med at Vanderbilt, then medical school at Emory, then a cardiology fellowship at Johns Hopkins. Every step was clean and expected, and every step was celebrated the way a general celebrates a battlefield victory. I was the one who complicated things. I was good at science. I won a state biology competition when I was 15. I shadowed my father in his practice every summer through high school, watching him work, watching the way his hands moved with absolute confidence. For a long time, I thought I wanted that too. Not because I loved surgery, because I wanted him to look at me the way he looked at my brother. I got into medical school. The University of Louisville, which is not Johns Hopkins, a fact my father mentioned exactly once and then never mentioned again, because not mentioning it was worse. I made it do the first 2 years. Then, during my 3rd year clerkship, I was placed in a psychiatric unit for 6 weeks. And something inside me cracked open. I remember the first patient I sat with alone. She was 44 years old, a former kindergarten teacher, and she hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. Not because she couldn't, because she had stopped believing that anything she said mattered. I sat with her for 40 minutes. I didn't have a treatment plan. I didn't know what I was doing. I just talked to her about small things, about the weather, about a bird I'd seen on my walk to the hospital that morning. And at the end of those 40 minutes, she said one word. Cardinals, she said. I love cardinals. I went home that night and I cried for an hour. Not from sadness. From something I didn't have a name for yet. That feeling when you find the thing you were built to do and your whole body knows it before your brain catches up. I withdrew from medical school 3 months later. My father didn't raise his voice. He was too controlled for that. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, his hands flat on the surface, and he looked at me with an expression I have spent years trying to forget. Not anger. Worse than anger. The particular look of a man who has decided, in that moment, that he has finally confirmed a long-held suspicion. You're not built for the real world, he said. You never were. My brother wasn't at that conversation, but he found out, the way he always found out about things that would give him leverage. That weekend, when we were all supposed to have dinner together, he sat across from me and said, very casually, "So you're going to be a feelings therapist." And then he laughed, and my father almost smiled, and I cut my chicken into pieces I didn't eat. I went back to school. I got my nursing degree, then my master's, then my psychiatric nurse practitioner certification. I built something from the ground up, patient by patient, case by case. The work was brutal, and it was unglamorous, and it was mine. My father called it nursing homework for 3 years before he stopped mentioning it at all. I didn't go home often after that, not because I was dramatic about it, just because the energy it cost me to sit at that table and be invisible was energy I needed for my patients. I built my own life in Nashville. A good apartment, a caseload that pushed me, colleagues who became friends. I had a life that fit me the way nothing in my parents' house ever had. Then my brother got engaged. Her name is Felicity, and she is genuinely lovely, which made it easier to say yes when she asked me to be a bridesmaid. She had nothing to do with the dynamics of my family. She just loved my brother, which I had decided to consider her one flaw and move past. I said yes. I came home. I put on the sage green dress. I should have known something was off the moment my father sat down at the head table with the look he gets when he's building up to something. That particular straightness of his spine, the way his eyes swept the room like he was counting who was watching. The toast was supposed to be to the couple. He spoke about my brother for 4 minutes, his residency, his accomplishments, the kind of son who made everything worthwhile. He said, "A father's greatest pride," twice. Then he pivoted. "I have 2 children," he said. "My son chose medicine. My daughter," and here he paused, doing the thing he does where silence is the weapon, "chose a different path." Another pause. 3 years of medical school. 3 years of our investment. Then she decided that wasn't for her. He smiled at the room. "We support all our children's choices, of course, but some choices have consequences." The room went quiet, not the comfortable kind. Felicity, to her credit, looked mortified. My brother was looking at his champagne flute with an expression of studied blankness that I knew meant he was pleased. And I was sitting at table 11 in my sage dress, breathing. Just breathing. Here's what I knew that my father didn't. 7 weeks earlier, I had been asked to present my research at a federal mental health symposium in Washington, D.C. My work on de-escalation protocols in high-security psychiatric settings had been referenced in a federal sentencing guideline revision. I'd flown in and out in 48 hours, given a 40-minute presentation to a room full of federal judges and correctional policy directors, and flown home to see a patient who needed me that afternoon. I hadn't told my father. I hadn't told my brother. I'd learned a long time ago that sharing things with them was like handing someone a knife and then acting surprised when they used it. What I also knew was that sitting at a table near the back of the symposium that day was a woman named Dr. Catherine Voss, a federal judge, a keynote speaker, a former U.S. attorney, and a woman with a reputation for being the sharpest person in any room she entered. She had stopped me after my presentation, asked 3 questions, and then asked for my card. I'd given it to her, figured it was courtesy, and thought nothing else of it. I thought nothing of it until 3 weeks before the wedding, when she called. "I'm doing a keynote address," she told me, "at the Kentucky Medical Ethics Symposium. It's in Louisville. I was wondering if you'd be willing to sit on the panel." I sat very still for a moment. The Kentucky Medical Ethics Symposium was, in my father's world, the equivalent of Carnegie Hall. He had attended it for 11 consecutive years. He had served on its board. He gave a lecture there every other year on surgical ethics that he talked about, the way some men talk about their military service. I asked Dr. Voss when it was. She told me it was the weekend after my brother's wedding. "I'll be there," I said. I hadn't planned it. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't strategy. I was going to that symposium because I had been invited and because the work mattered and because Dr. Voss was someone worth sitting next to in a room. That it overlapped with my father's universe was not something I had engineered. But there I was at table 11, listening to my father tell 200 people about my failure, and I knew what was coming. And I felt, for the first time, a kind of stillness that wasn't defeat. I didn't stand up. I didn't say anything. I just sat through the rest of that toast and the rest of that dinner, and I danced with Felicity during the mother-daughter dance, because her mother had passed away and she'd asked me the week before, and I had said yes. I danced with her and she whispered, "I'm so sorry," in my ear. And I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. My brother found me near the end of the night, by the bar, in that way he has of appearing when he wants something confirmed. "You okay?" he asked, which in our family means the opposite. "I'm great," I said, and I meant it. I want to tell you about the person who saw it first. Her name is Ren, and she's been my best friend since we were placed as roommates in our undergraduate nursing program at age 19. She is the kind of friend who shows up at 11 p.m. with Thai food when you've had a bad week, not because you asked, but because she remembered what you said Thursday. She is the only person in my life who has never once made me feel like my career needed defending. Ren was not at the wedding. She was in Seattle for a conference. She texted me that night, "How'd it go?" I sent back, "Your standard family dinner except 200 witnesses." She called immediately. I sat outside on the venue's side porch in my sage dress, the Kentucky summer pressing in warm and close, and I told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment when I finished. "He did that," she said. "Not a question. He did that." Another pause. "Audra, the symposium is next weekend." "I know." "Does he know you're on the panel?" "No." I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Then, "Okay, I'm flying in." "Ren, you don't have to." "I'm flying in," she said again. "You're not sitting in that room alone." That's Ren. That's what she is. She didn't offer advice. She didn't tell me what to say or how to handle it. She just said she'd be there. And in my experience, that is the rarest and most valuable thing one person can offer another. The Kentucky Medical Ethics Symposium was held at the Galt House Hotel, the kind of place with chandeliers and marble floors and the specific smell of institutional prestige. I arrived early. Ren was already there, holding 2 cups of coffee, wearing an expression of determined calm that I recognized as her version of battle readiness. I found Dr. Voss in the green room. She was reviewing her notes, unhurried, and she looked up when I came in and said, "There she is. I've been recommending your de-escalation research to 3 people this week. You've made my job harder because now I have to explain that I met you before it was obvious you were going to be important." I laughed. It was the first real laugh I had in 8 days. The panel was at 2 in the afternoon. The room held 350 people. Physicians, researchers, ethicists, healthcare policy directors. I knew it before I walked in, but walking in made it real in a different way. I found my seat at the panelist table. I poured a glass of water. I looked out at the room. My father was in the 4th row. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. I watched his expression move through confusion, then recognition, then something I had never seen on his face directed at me. Something that looked almost like uncertainty. My brother was beside him. His face did something complicated that I didn't have time to interpret. Dr. Voss opened the panel. She introduced each of us in turn, and when she got to me, she said the following. Audra Calloway is the lead psychiatric consultant for the Federal Bureau of Prisons, Eastern District. Her de-escalation protocol has been adopted in 14 federal facilities. Her research was cited this year in the revised federal sentencing guidelines for mentally ill defendants. She was, frankly, the reason I wanted to do this panel. 350 people turned to look at me. I didn't look at my father. I looked at Dr. Voss, and I nodded, and I said, "Thank you. Let's get started." The panel ran 90 minutes. I talked about what I know. What happens to a human mind in conditions of extreme confinement? How language and approach can mean the difference between a managed crisis and a fatality. Why the mental health infrastructure of the correctional system is a public health emergency that most people with medical degrees prefer not to think about. I talked about patients without using their names. I talked about the kindergarten teacher and the cardinal. Though I didn't say it that way, I said, sometimes the most clinical thing you can do is be a human being in the room. Afterward, a woman from the 4th row came up to the panelist table. She was a trauma surgeon from Cincinnati, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of direct handshake that means she doesn't waste time. 20 years ago, she told me, I had a patient who we couldn't reach. We kept trying clinical approaches, medication adjustments, behavior plans. Nothing. A psychiatric nurse, not a doctor, a nurse, came in and sat with her for an hour and just talked. We never figured out what she said, but the patient started eating again that week. She looked at me steadily. We need more people who can do that. Your work matters. She shook my hand again and walked away. I turned around. My father was standing 6 feet from me, his hands at his sides, his posture different than I had ever seen it. He looked older suddenly. Or maybe he just looked smaller. My brother was behind him, slightly off to one side, not smiling. I waited. Audra, my father said, and then he stopped. He looked at the table where I'd been sitting. He looked at the program in his hand, which had my name and my title and my institutional affiliations printed in clean black type. He said nothing for a long moment. "I didn't know," he finally said. "I know you didn't," I said. He opened his mouth again and then closed it. My brother said, "You should have told us," and I looked at him, and he stopped talking. My father looked at me, and the particular look he had, the confirming a suspicion look, was completely gone. What was there instead was something I didn't quite have a name for. Not pride, we weren't there yet, and maybe we'd never be. But something in the neighborhood of reckoning, the expression of a man who was beginning to understand the dimensions of a room he thought he knew. "I'm sorry," he said. "About last weekend. He stopped. "That was wrong of me." I had rehearsed this moment for years. In the shower, in the car, in the half-conscious space before sleep, I had imagined what I would say when he finally said sorry. I had imagined myself being cold, or devastating, or unbothered, or gracious. I had played every version. What actually happened was that I felt something release in my chest. Not forgiveness. I wasn't there yet, and that was allowed. But the ending of something. The closing of a wound that had been open for 2 decades and had been bleeding so slowly I'd stopped noticing. "I know," I said simply. "I know it was." I shook Dr. Voss's hand at the door and thanked her. Ren was waiting for me in the lobby with her coat over her arm, and when she saw my face, she said nothing. She just fell into step beside me, and we walked out into the Louisville afternoon. The months after that were quieter than I expected. My father didn't call immediately. He wasn't built for immediate. But 6 weeks later, he left a voicemail that said, in his measured surgeon's voice, that he had shared my research paper with a colleague at Emory, and that the colleague had found it very solid. From my father, in his language. That was a cathedral. My brother took longer. That was fine. I wasn't waiting anymore. What changed was something internal and harder to describe. I had spent so many years carrying a case I needed to make. A brief I was always prepared to argue. That my work mattered. That my choices were legitimate. That I was not, in fact, wasting my life. That brief had been so heavy for so long that I had stopped noticing the weight. After the symposium, I put it down. That fall, I started a training program at my facility. Young clinicians, mostly nurses, learning what I had spent 12 years figuring out the hard way. How to sit in a room with someone who has stopped believing their words matter. How to listen for what isn't being said. How to be a human being first and a professional second, in that order, always. In my first session, I told them the cardinal story. One of them, a 23-year-old from Bowling Green, who was smart and a little scared and reminded me of myself in a way that made my chest ache, stayed after and said, "No one ever told me it was okay to just sit with someone. I thought I was supposed to fix things." I knew that feeling down to the bone. "You don't fix people," I told her. "You just make it safe enough for them to fix themselves." She wrote it down in a small notebook. I watched her do it. I have a photograph on my desk that Ren took the day I received my nurse practitioner certification. I'm standing outside the testing center in Nashville in November, still in my coat, holding the paper they gave me, squinting a little into the sun. I'm not glamorous in it. I look tired and windblown and completely, absolutely certain. My father has never seen that photo. Someday I might show it to him. Or I might not. I'm still deciding what kind of space he gets in the life I built. And I'm doing that deciding slowly and on my own terms. That's allowed too. What I know is this. I am not the girl who needed his toast to name her. I am not the sum of what he failed to see. I am 32 years old, and I have sat in rooms with people at the absolute end of their rope and helped them find one more reason to stay. That is not a fantasy. That is not a lesser version of a real career. That is the realest work I have ever known. And somewhere in a federal facility I can't name, a woman who hadn't spoken in 6 months said her first word to me on a Tuesday afternoon. She said, "Window, window." I wrote it down. I still have the note. There's a photograph on my desk of a woman squinting into November sunlight, holding a piece of paper, looking windblown and exhausted and completely certain. That woman is me. And for a long time, I couldn't look at it without hearing my father's voice underneath the image. The one that said I wasn't built for the real world. I think about cause and effect a lot now. Not in a mystical way, just a plain observable kind. The kind where choices stack up over years and eventually become a life. My father made choices. So did I. And the difference between where we each ended up on that afternoon at the Galt House wasn't luck. It was the accumulated weight of everything we had each decided to do with what we were given. He chose to perform. I chose to listen. For 20 years, that looked like his advantage. And then one day it didn't. What I've come to understand is that doing right by people, not just by the ones who can advance your career or validate your name, but by the ones who have nothing to offer you except their trust, that is not a soft skill. It is the hardest skill there is. I chose a career that asked me to sit in rooms with people at the absolute bottom and find a way to be useful anyway. Not impressive. Not acclaimed. Useful. That choice was a moral one before it was a professional one. And I think I knew that the day I walked onto that psychiatric unit and sat with a woman who had stopped speaking. Something in me recognized that this was where integrity lived. Not in performance, but in presence. The intelligence part came later, or maybe it came alongside. Learning to hear what people aren't saying. Building frameworks for understanding human behavior in conditions of extreme stress. Translating that into policy, into training, into a language that federal judges and correctional directors could act on. None of that happened because I was talented. It happened because I kept showing up and kept paying attention even when no one was watching, even when the room was cold and the fluorescent lights hummed and the work was invisible to everyone who measured success in status. And then there's the third thing, the one that doesn't get named as often as it should. The refusal to stop. My father called it stubbornness. He wasn't entirely wrong. But stubbornness without direction is just noise. What I had was something more specific, a willingness to keep going in the right direction even when it cost me things I wanted. His approval, the cleaner story, the easier path. I paid every one of those costs, and I kept walking. Ren showed up with coffee. Catherine Voss asked the right question. A woman in a federal facility said, "Window on a Tuesday afternoon." None of those moments were dramatic. They were just true. My father said I wasn't built for the real world. What I know now is that the real world is not the one he was describing. The real world is the one where a 23-year-old from Bowling Green writes down something you said in a small notebook because no one has ever given her permission to just sit with someone. That is the real world. And I was built for exactly that. I wrote it down. I still have the note.